I woke up, or at least, I think I did. My body felt heavy, pinned to the mattress, as if the weight of the entire world was pressing down on me. My room looked the same, my dresser against the far wall, the bookshelves crowded with old paperbacks, the soft glow of the streetlight spilling in through the curtains. But something felt wrong, an almost imperceptible shift in the atmosphere, like a familiar melody being played in a minor key. I lay there, still as a stone, staring at the ceiling. For what felt like an eternity, I was caught in that strange in-between state, halfway awake, halfway dreaming. My limbs were numb, unresponsive, as if they didn't belong to me. Sleep paralysis, I told myself. It was just another episode, a trick of the mind. I tried to calm the surge of panic that tightened my chest, but then I blinked and everything snapped back into focus. I could move again. I lifted my arms slowly, flexing my fingers, my joints stiff and aching. My heart was still racing, but I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering terror that always came with these episodes. But this time, something was different. The air in my room felt thick, almost oily, and my vision was off. Everything seemed too sharp, too clear, as if the edges of the room had been etched in glass. The shadows were deeper, more substantial, almost solid. I sat up slowly, glancing around, trying to convince myself that I was awake. But was I? I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the lingering fog from my mind, but it didn't help. My skin tingled, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still trapped in some sort of dream. I ran my hands along the sheets, feeling the familiar texture of the fabric, the small tear in the corner where I had accidentally ripped it months ago. Everything seemed real, solid, but I couldn't trust it, not after what I had just experienced. I turned my head slowly, scanning the room. It was just my bedroom, messy, cluttered, the way it always was. But as I looked closer, tiny details began to stand out, details that shouldn't have been there. The books on the shelf were in the wrong order. The poster on the wall, the one I had torn down years ago, was back up, but faded, almost translucent. And the mirror hanging on the opposite wall, hadn't I moved that to the hallway? My heart began to pound again, the familiar grip of panic tightening around my chest. This wasn't right. Something was wrong. I reached over to my bedside table, grabbing my phone, but the screen stayed dark no matter how many times I tapped it. No battery. I had charged it before bed. I was sure of it. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, standing up slowly. My knees felt weak, unsteady, and for a moment the floor seemed to shift under my feet, like I was standing on the deck of a boat. I staggered, catching myself on the edge of the dresser, the wood cool and solid beneath my fingers. I took a deep breath, willing the world to stop spinning. I needed to get out of this room. I stumbled toward the door, my footsteps strangely muffled, as if the carpet was swallowing the sound. I reached for the doorknob, but the moment my fingers touched it, I froze. There was something on the other side. A shadow, dark and indistinct, slithered across the gap between the door and the floor. It moved slowly, deliberately, a long, sinuous shape that twisted and writhed like smoke. I held my breath, my hand hovering just inches from the doorknob, staring at that narrow strip of darkness. The shadow stopped, as if sensing my presence, and then began to retreat, slipping away into the hallway beyond. I yanked my hand back, my heart hammering. What the hell was that? I stepped back, glancing around the room, half expecting to see more shadows creeping in from the corners. But everything was still, quiet. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Was I still dreaming? I needed to know. I pinched the skin on my arm, hard, but the pain felt dull, distant, like it was happening to someone else. I clenched my teeth and pinched harder, the skin turning red under my nails, but nothing changed. The room didn't waver, didn't dissolve into the fog of a dream. It just stayed there, solid and unchanging. I turned back to the door, hesitating. If this was a dream, then opening that door wouldn't matter. It was just a projection, an illusion. But if it wasn't, I steeled myself and grabbed the doorknob, twisting it slowly. The door swung open with a low creak, revealing the dark hallway beyond. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing, staring out into the blackness. There was nothing there. No shadow, no figure lurking in the darkness. Just the empty hall, stretching out to the staircase at the far end. I stepped into the hallway, my skin prickling as if the air itself was charged with electricity. The shadows seemed thicker out here, clinging to the walls and floor, but I forced myself to keep moving. I needed to get downstairs, to get out of this house, to feel the cold night air on my face. If I could just get outside, I'd know for sure if I was awake or still trapped in some twisted version of my own mind. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step echoing loudly in the silence. I kept my eyes on the floor, refusing to look back at the darkened hallway behind me. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a crawling sensation that made my skin itch and burn. I reached the bottom of the stairs and froze. The front door was open. It swung gently on its hinges, a faint breeze blowing in from outside. The night air was cool, but there was something wrong about the way it felt. Too sharp, too thin. I stepped toward the door, my eyes fixed on the sliver of darkness beyond, when I saw it. A figure stood just outside the threshold, its form barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs long and spindly like something stretched too far. It didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stood there, its head tilted slightly to one side, watching me. My throat tightened and I took a step back. The figure leaned forward, its outline flickering like a bad signal. I blinked, and suddenly it was closer, standing just inside the doorway, its face, or what should have been its face, hidden in the deep shadows. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but the figure didn't follow. It just stood there, a dark silhouette against the faint glow of the streetlight outside. And then, slowly, it raised one long, thin arm, its fingers curling into a beckoning gesture. I turned and ran. The hallway stretched out before me, longer than it should have been, the walls twisting and warping as I sprinted down it. I could hear the thing behind me, a soft, skittering sound like nails scratching against wood. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. The house seemed to shift around me, doors appearing and disappearing, the floor buckling and creaking under my feet. I reached my bedroom and slammed the door shut, throwing the bolt. I stood there, gasping for breath, listening to the silence on the other side. For a moment, everything was still, and then the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, almost lazily, it twisted back and forth, as if the thing outside was toying with me. I backed away, my eyes locked on the door, my body trembling with fear. The knob rattled, the sound echoing in the empty room, and then it stopped. The door didn't open. The doorknob didn't move again, but I could feel it out there, standing just beyond the threshold, waiting. I turned slowly, my gaze sweeping over the room, and my heart stopped. The bed was empty. The sheets were rumpled, the pillow indented, but I wasn't in it. I stared at the empty bed, my mind reeling, and then slowly I turned to the mirror on the wall. My reflection stared back at me, its eyes wide with terror, its body stiff and unmoving. And then it smiled. My own face twisted into a grin that didn't belong to me. My reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass, the smile widening, the eyes dark and empty. And I knew in that moment that I wasn't awake. I had never woken up. I was still trapped, still caught in that suffocating web of dreams, and whatever was standing in the mirror wasn't me. It was waiting for me to wake up, waiting for me to take its place. The reflection leaned closer, its lips parting in a silent laugh, and I felt myself being pulled forward, drawn toward the mirror, toward that twisted version of myself. And then, everything went dark. I woke up again, gasping, my body trembling. The room was empty, the bed beneath me solid and real, but the mirror on the wall was shattered, the glass splintered and cracked, and in the shards I could see it, my reflection, still smiling, still watching. And I knew with a sickening certainty that the next time I fell asleep, I wouldn't wake up, not as myself. It wasn't my first choice for a place to spend the night. The abandoned lake house sat at the far end of the lake, nestled among the thick woods, half hidden by the overgrown vegetation that had slowly taken over the property. The roof sagged, the paint was peeling, and most of the windows were either boarded up or broken. But it was getting dark, and I hadn't planned on hiking back to my car in the middle of the night. So I convinced myself that the house was as good a place as any to rest for a few hours. After all, it was just one night. The inside of the house was even worse than I'd imagined. The smell of mildew and damp wood hit me the moment I stepped through the door, and I had to cover my nose to keep from gagging. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust, the wooden floorboards creaking under my weight. Old, rotting furniture was scattered around, broken chairs, a sagging sofa, and a toppled-over table. There was graffiti on the walls, most of it just crude drawings and words, but some of it more disturbing. Phrases like, "never leave," "he watches," and a crudely drawn set of eyes that seemed to follow me no matter where I moved. I should have left then, but the darkness outside was growing thicker, and I didn't want to risk getting lost in the woods at night. I decided to make the best of it. I found a relatively clean spot in what used to be the living room and spread out my sleeping bag. The house was cold, and I shivered as I settled down, the wind outside howling softly through the broken windows. The night felt oppressive, the air thick with a sense of abandonment that seemed to seep into my bones. I kept my flashlight close, the beam cutting through the dark whenever I thought I heard a noise, a distant creak of the floorboards, the skittering of something small and quick in the walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, or maybe some animals that had made their home here long after the people left. Hours seemed to pass, and sleep wouldn't come. The house was too silent, too empty, and every shadow seemed to hold something hidden, something just out of sight. I kept glancing at the boarded-up windows, half expecting to see something moving outside, or worse, looking in. Finally, sometime in the early morning hours, exhaustion won out. My body felt heavy, my thoughts sluggish, and I closed my eyes, letting myself sink into the darkness. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up, everything had changed. My eyes opened, but I couldn't move. I was lying on my back, staring up at the cracked, moldy ceiling, my body completely frozen. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't even twitch my fingers, couldn't shift my head. I was trapped in my own body, my muscles locked in place, as if I were bound by invisible chains. I tried to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. I could only lie there, my eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for something, anything, that would help me. That's when I noticed it. The shadows in the room had shifted. The corner of the living room, the one that had been empty when I laid down, was now darker, the blackness there thick and impenetrable, like a pool of ink. I stared at it, my heart hammering in my chest, and slowly, a shape began to emerge. It was subtle at first, just a slight movement, a shifting of the darkness, but then I saw it. A figure, hunched and twisted, unfolding itself from the shadow. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs long and angular, the joints bending in ways that made my stomach turn. The head was bowed, the face hidden in the dark, but I could feel its eyes on me. Even though I couldn't see them, I knew it was watching me. I wanted to close my eyes to shut out the sight of it, but I couldn't. My gaze was locked on the figure as it slowly stepped forward, its movements unnaturally fluid, like a spider creeping toward its prey. The floorboards didn't creak beneath its weight. It moved soundlessly, gliding across the rotting wood, its shadow stretching out toward me like fingers reaching to pull me in. The figure stopped at the foot of my sleeping bag, towering over me, its head tilted slightly to one side as if it were studying me. I could see more of it now, the way its shoulders jutted out sharply, the long, thin arms that hung limply at its sides. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and where its face should have been, there was nothing but smooth, blank flesh. My chest tightened as the thing slowly bent down, leaning closer until its head was level with mine. I could see every detail now. The way the skin rippled slightly, like fabric stretched too tightly over bone, the faint impression of something moving just beneath the surface. It brought one hand up, long fingers twitching slightly, and reached out toward my face. I tried to scream, tried to thrash, to kick, but my body refused to obey. I could only watch as its hand hovered inches from my cheek, the fingers trembling, twitching, as if it were savoring the anticipation. Then it touched me. A jolt of ice-cold terror shot through me, every nerve in my body screaming in silent agony. Its touch was light, almost gentle, the tips of its fingers brushing against my skin. The coldness spread from the point of contact, seeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. The thing leaned closer, its face, or lack of a face, mere inches from mine. I could hear it now, a faint, rasping sound, like a breath drawn through teeth that weren't there. The smooth surface of its face rippled slightly, and for a moment I thought I saw a hint of a mouth, a suggestion of twisted lips forming in the blankness. The thing pressed its fingers harder against my cheek, the pressure increasing until I thought my skull would crack. And then slowly, it began to lean forward, its head dipping down toward my chest. I couldn't breathe. I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on me, pinning me to the bed. The darkness seemed to close in, the edges of my vision blurring, and I knew that if I didn't wake up, if I didn't break free, it would take me, drag me down into whatever hellish place it had come from. With a sudden, violent jerk, I broke free. I shot upright, gasping for air, my body drenched in sweat. The room was empty, the shadows gone, but the memory of its touch lingered, a cold, crawling sensation that made my skin prickle. I scrambled out of the sleeping bag, my heart still racing, and grabbed my flashlight, shining it frantically around the room. There was nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the same empty, decaying living room. But I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. My skin still burned where it had touched me, a faint ache spreading through my bones. I didn't wait to gather my things. I shoved the sleeping bag into my pack, threw open the door, and ran. The cold night air hit me like a shock, the wind howling through the trees, and I didn't stop running until I was back at the trail, gasping and trembling. I never went back to that house. I didn't tell anyone what happened, didn't even try to explain. But every now and then, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I feel it again. That weight, that suffocating pressure on my chest. I see the dark corner of the room, feel the cold fingers brushing against my skin. And I know that one day, when I'm too tired to fight, too exhausted to resist, I'll open my eyes and see it standing over me again, waiting to finish what it started. And this time, I won't wake up. It started with small things at first. Waking up in the middle of the night, unable to move, my heart hammering in my chest as if I'd been running. At first, I thought it was just nightmares, the kind that cling to you even after you open your eyes. I'd lie there, frozen in bed, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, waiting for my body to wake up completely. It would last only a few seconds, maybe a minute at most, and then I'd be able to move again, shaking it off with a deep breath. But then the episodes began happening more frequently. I would drift off to sleep, my body heavy and exhausted, only to find myself trapped in that strange limbo state, somewhere between waking and sleeping, paralyzed and terrified. The feeling of being held down, of something pressing against my chest, became stronger each time, as if some invisible force was bearing down on me. I started avoiding sleep. I'd drink coffee late into the night, keep the TV on at all hours, anything to keep myself awake. I'd try to power through until dawn, waiting for the sun to come up before letting myself nod off. It worked for a while, but exhaustion catches up with you eventually. You can only push your body so far before it demands rest, no matter how much you fight it. One night, after nearly 48 hours without sleep, I finally crashed. I remember the heavy pull of sleep, dragging me down like quicksand, my eyes slipping shut no matter how hard I tried to keep them open. And then I was out, swallowed up by the darkness. When I woke up, I couldn't move. My eyes flew open, my heart already pounding, but my body felt like lead, pinned to the bed by some invisible weight. I tried to lift my arms, to wiggle my fingers, but nothing happened. The familiar feeling of panic surged through me, but this time it was different. This time I wasn't alone. There was something in the room with me. I couldn't see it, not at first, but I could feel its presence. A cold, suffocating sensation that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. My eyes darted around the room, searching the darkness, but I couldn't turn my head, couldn't sit up. I was trapped, helpless, my body completely unresponsive. And then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the rest, moved in the corner of the room. It was just a shape at first, indistinct and shifting, but as I stared, it began to take form. Long, thin limbs, a twisted, hunched figure that seemed to glide rather than walk. It moved slowly, deliberately, its outline flickering in and out of focus, like a bad signal on an old TV screen. It stopped at the foot of my bed, and I could feel its eyes on me, eyes that I couldn't see but knew were there, boring into me, studying me. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, every muscle in my body straining against the paralysis, desperate to move, to run. But I couldn't. I was completely, utterly helpless. The figure moved closer, its shape shifting in the darkness, its limbs long and spindly, almost insect-like. It leaned over me, its face, or what I thought might be its face, hovering just above mine. A low, raspy sound filled the room, like the whisper of dry leaves scraping against each other. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth wouldn't open, my throat wouldn't work. All I could do was stare, wide-eyed and terrified, as the thing leaned closer, its shadowy form blotting out the dim light from the hallway. The whispering grew louder, filling my ears, but I couldn't make out the words. It was a language I didn't recognize, something ancient and wrong, a series of hissing syllables that made my skin crawl, and then it touched me. A long, skeletal hand reached out, its fingers impossibly thin, the tips sharp and pointed like claws. It brushed against my cheek, a cold, crawling sensation that made every nerve in my body scream in protest. The fingers trailed down to my throat, resting there lightly, just above my pulse. I could feel its touch, icy and insubstantial, and I knew, somehow, that if it wanted to, it could crush my windpipe with the slightest pressure. But it didn't. It just held its hand there, its fingers brushing against my skin, as if testing me, feeling the way my heart raced beneath its touch. The paralysis broke suddenly, like a snapped wire, and I jerked upright with a gasp, my body drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was empty, the shadowy figure gone, but the memory of its touch lingered, a cold, clammy feeling that refused to fade. I didn't sleep again that night. I couldn't. I stayed up, pacing the room, every muscle tense, my eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner. I knew it wasn't just a dream. I had felt it, that thing in the room with me, as real as the bed beneath me, as real as the fear that still gripped my chest. The next few nights, I tried everything to stay awake. More coffee, energy drinks, blasting music in my headphones, but no matter how hard I fought, sleep eventually pulled me under, and each time the paralysis came back, stronger, more suffocating. The figure was always there, lurking at the edge of my vision, its form shifting and flickering in the darkness. Each time it got closer. Each time, it stayed longer. It would hover over me, its hand reaching out to touch my face, my throat, its whispering growing louder, almost frantic. I started sleeping during the day, hoping that the sunlight would keep it at bay, but it didn't help. The figure came regardless, slipping through the cracks in my mind, twisting the shadows into its shape. I could feel myself unraveling, the lack of sleep taking its toll, my nerves frayed and raw. I stopped eating, stopped leaving the house. I didn't want to be around people, didn't want them to see what I was becoming. I couldn't explain it to anyone, couldn't tell them about the thing that came for me in the night, the thing that whispered in my ear, the thing that left icy handprints on my skin. One night, after days of fighting sleep, I finally collapsed. I remember the sensation of falling, the darkness rushing up to meet me, and then I was back in bed, trapped in that awful, suffocating stillness. My eyes flew open, my body frozen, and I knew, even before I saw it, that the figure was there. But this time, something was different. It wasn't standing at the foot of the bed, it was sitting on my chest. I could feel its weight, crushing, suffocating, its cold, clawed hands pressing down on my shoulders, pinning me to the mattress. Its face, if it even had a face, was just inches from mine, a black, shifting void that seemed to ripple and writhe like smoke. The whispering was louder now, a frantic, desperate sound that filled my ears, my mind, making it impossible to think. I tried to scream, tried to move, but I was completely paralyzed. The figure leaned closer, its claws digging into my skin, and I felt something wet and cold drip onto my cheek. A low, rasping laugh filled the room, and I realized with a sickening jolt of terror that it wasn't just touching me anymore. It was sinking into me. I felt its cold, insubstantial form pressing against my skin, pushing through my flesh, slipping inside me. The sensation was unbearable, like ice spreading through my veins, like oil seeping into my bones. My vision blurred, the room spinning around me, and I knew, somehow, that if I didn't wake up, if I didn't get out of that bed, it would take me. It would become part of me. With a final desperate effort, I wrenched myself free, the paralysis breaking with a violent jolt. I sat up, gasping, my body trembling, the sweat cold on my skin. The room was empty, the shadowy figure gone, but I knew it wasn't over. The next morning I noticed the bruises. dark, finger-shaped marks on my shoulders, my throat, as if something had gripped me, held me down. I tried to tell myself it was just my own hands, that I had done it to myself in my sleep, but I knew the truth. It's still with me, hiding just below the surface, waiting for the next time I close my eyes. And each time it gets a little closer, a little deeper. I'm afraid to sleep now. I'm afraid that the next time I wake up, I won't be alone. And when I look in the mirror, I see something else looking back. Something dark, something twisted, something that isn't quite me. And I know that one night I won't wake up at all. It will take me completely, and I'll be trapped in the darkness forever, a silent prisoner inside my own mind. It was a cold October evening, and the chill had settled into the house like an unwanted guest. The wind outside howled softly, rattling the windows and causing the bare branches of the trees to scratch against the panes. I had bundled up in a thick sweater and wrapped myself in a blanket, settling into my worn-out recliner in the living room, hoping to relax and distract myself from the loneliness that always seemed to creep in with the longer, darker nights. The TV flickered softly in front of me, the muted glow casting long shadows across the walls. I wasn't paying much attention to it, a rerun of some old crime show I'd seen a dozen times before, but the steady hum of voices and music provided a kind of comforting background noise. I sipped my lukewarm tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest, and tried to lose myself in the mundane predictability of the plot. I must have been dozing off because the sudden change in the room startled me. One moment, I was staring blankly at the familiar show, and the next, the screen went black, then crackled to life again, but something was off. The channel had changed on its own. I blinked, confused, sitting up straighter in the chair. The remote was on the coffee table, untouched, and I hadn't leaned on any buttons. I glanced around the room, feeling a strange unease settle in my stomach, but everything was the same, silent, still. I looked back at the TV, squinting at the screen. What I saw sent a shiver down my spine. It was my living room, the same room I was sitting in, down to every last detail, the faded wallpaper, the clutter of books on the side table, even the old blanket draped over the back of the couch. But it wasn't just a similar room. It was my living room. The camera seemed to be positioned at a low angle, as if it were perched somewhere near the floor, looking up at the very spot I was sitting. My heart started to pound. I leaned forward, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no mistaking it. I was watching a live feed of my own house. But there was no camera in my living room, nothing that could be broadcasting this image. And then I saw it. A figure moved into frame, stepping into view from the hallway. I felt my breath catch in my throat. It was me, or at least it looked like me. The same hair, the same build, wearing the same sweater I had on now. But there was something wrong. The figure, the me on the screen, wasn't quite right. It stood in the center of the room, staring at the spot where I was sitting. And it was smiling. Not a normal smile, either. It was a wide, unnatural grin, the kind of smile that stretched too far, pulling the lips back to reveal too much of the teeth. The eyes were wide, unblinking, and there was no warmth in them, no recognition. Just that awful, empty smile. I jerked back in my chair, my pulse racing. The figure on the screen didn't move, just stood there, grinning at me. I reached for the remote with shaking hands, fumbling to change the channel, to turn off the TV, but the screen didn't respond. The image remained, unchanging, frozen in that bizarre tableau. I dropped the remote, my hands slick with sweat. My gaze darted around the room, searching for what? There was no one else here. Just me, alone in my living room, watching myself. I glanced back at the screen, and my stomach dropped. The other me was moving again. Slowly, with deliberate, jerky motions, it began to walk forward. Step by step, it approached the camera, the grin never wavering, the eyes never leaving mine. The closer it got, the more distorted its face became, the grin stretching wider, the teeth sharper, almost serrated. It moved as if it were struggling against invisible strings, its arms hanging limply at its sides. My heart was hammering in my chest, my skin prickling with cold fear. I stood up from the chair, backing away from the TV. As I moved, the figure on the screen tilted its head slightly, its grin widening. It paused for a moment, as if studying me, then raised one hand slowly, lifting it to point at the camera, at me. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing tighter and tighter around me. I glanced around, half expecting to see... what? The other me, standing in the corner, that awful grin fixed in place. I forced myself to breathe, to think. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. It was some kind of sick joke, a glitch, a prank. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The figure took another step forward, filling the screen. Its eyes were black now, hollow pits that seemed to swallow the light. The grin stretched impossibly wide, the lips splitting at the corners, and then it spoke. But the sound didn't come from the TV. It came from behind me. "Hello," it whispered, the voice low and rasping like dry leaves scraping together. My blood ran cold, and I spun around, my heart in my throat. The living room was empty, no one there, no other me. Just the silent house, the shadows deepening in the corners, the TV flickering softly behind me. But I had heard it, I knew I had heard it. That voice, that awful rasping whisper. It was too close, too real. Slowly I turned back to the TV. The other me was still there, its face pressed almost up against the camera now, filling the screen. The eyes, black, empty voids, seemed to bore into me, and the grin was all wrong. It wasn't just smiling, it was mocking me. "Are you scared?" it whispered, its voice crackling through the speakers. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. This wasn't possible. It was some kind of nightmare, some hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But no matter how many times I blinked, how many times I pinched myself, the scene on the screen didn't change. The other me tilted its head, still grinning. "I can see you," it whispered. I took a step back, bumping into the coffee table. The grin on its face widened even further, stretching the skin taut, the lips splitting. The corners of its mouth began to bleed, thin rivulets of dark red trickling down its chin. "I'm coming," it rasped. I bolted for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, the cold metal slipping under my fingers. I could hear it behind me, the soft, shuffling sound of bare feet on carpet, the low, rasping breath. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I yanked the door open and stumbled out into the night, the icy air hitting me like a slap. I ran, my feet pounding on the pavement, my breath misting in the cold. I didn't stop until I was at the end of the street, my chest burning, my lungs aching. I turned back, half expecting to see it standing in the doorway, watching me with that awful grin. But the house was dark, silent. The front door was closed, the windows blank and empty. I stood there, trembling, trying to catch my breath, my eyes fixed on the living room window. There was no movement, no sign of anything. Slowly, I took a step forward, my heart still racing. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of waking nightmare brought on by stress and exhaustion? I edged closer to the house, my eyes scanning the windows for any sign of that figure. And then, in the darkness, I saw it. A face, just visible behind the living room window, its features twisted into that same unnatural grin. My face. It raised a hand, pressing it against the glass, and the grin widened, the teeth gleaming in the darkness. "Come home," it whispered. I turned and ran, the voice echoing in my ears. The grin burned into my mind. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, it would be waiting. Waiting for the moment I stepped back inside. Waiting for me to come home. It was late, and the streets were empty as I walked home from my shift at the diner. The air was crisp, the chill of autumn biting through my thin jacket. Dead leaves crunched under my feet as I made my way down the deserted sidewalk, their brittle rustling the only sound in the stillness. The only light came from the occasional flickering street lamp and the orange glow of carved pumpkins on doorsteps. Halloween was only a few days away, and the neighborhood had already started decorating. Plastic skeletons dangled from porches, and fake spiderwebs stretched across hedges, giving the quiet street an eerie feel. I wasn't usually nervous walking home at night. I'd done it 100 times before, and our small town was as quiet as they come. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the cold wind that seemed to whisper through the empty streets, or the fact that I hadn't seen a single car pass by in the last half hour. Whatever it was, I found myself walking faster, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. Halfway home, I took a shortcut through the park, the path winding through clusters of trees that stood tall and dark against the sky. The wind picked up, rattling the bare branches overhead. I was almost to the other side when I noticed it, a shadow moving behind me. I glanced back, my heart skipping a beat. A man was standing at the entrance to the park, partially hidden in the shadows of the trees. His silhouette was unmistakable, a tall, broad figure, dressed in dark clothes. His face was obscured, but there was something about the way he stood, unmoving, just watching me. I quickened my pace, my skin prickling. The path curved ahead, and I kept my eyes fixed forward, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my stomach. When I finally dared to glance back again, the man was gone. Relief washed over me. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or someone out for a late walk like me. Still, I didn't slow down. The sooner I got home, the better. I exited the park and turned onto Elm Street, the familiar houses lining the road a welcome sight. Most of the windows were dark, the residents long since gone to bed. I shoved my hands into my pockets, head down, and kept moving. But as I passed under a street lamp, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. Movement, just behind me. I looked back and my stomach dropped. The man was there again, closer this time. He was walking slowly, deliberately, his face still hidden in the shadows. But I could see it now. He was wearing a mask. Not one of those cheap plastic Halloween masks you see at costume shops, but something different, something more disturbing. It was an old, cracked porcelain mask, painted to look like a doll's face. The eyes were large and empty, the smile fixed in a cruel, mocking grin. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. He stopped too, just standing there, staring at me from behind that grotesque mask. My breath came in quick, shallow bursts as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of prank? A twisted joke? I turned and started walking again, faster now, almost jogging. I could hear his footsteps behind me, matching my pace. Every few seconds, I glanced over my shoulder, but he never sped up. He just kept following me, the distance between us closing little by little. Panic set in. I was still a few blocks from home, and there was no one else around. The houses were dark, the streets empty. I could run, but would it make a difference? He was too close now. I could feel his gaze boring into the back of my neck, and every instinct screamed at me to get away. I broke into a run. The sound of my footsteps echoed loudly in the empty street, and for a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. But then I heard it, his footsteps, quickening to match mine. I risked a glance back and saw him gaining on me, his long legs eating up the distance between us effortlessly. I ran faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs. The houses blurred past, my vision narrowing as I focused on just one thing, getting away. I turned the corner sharply, nearly slipping on the wet pavement, and sprinted down the next block. But no matter how fast I ran, I could still hear him behind me, the steady thud of his boots against the ground, the rasp of his breathing through that awful mask. I rounded another corner and nearly crashed into a fence blocking the alleyway. Panic surged as I realized I'd trapped myself. I turned around, chest heaving, and saw him standing at the mouth of the alley, his figure silhouetted by the dim streetlights. I backed up slowly, my gaze locked on his mask. He stepped forward, one slow, deliberate step at a time, his head cocked slightly to the side as if amused by my fear. My back hit the fence, and I realized there was nowhere left to go. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just kept moving toward me, each step slow and methodical, savoring the moment. I searched frantically for something, anything to defend myself, but the alley was empty except for a few piles of garbage bags. I grabbed the closest one and flung it at him, but he barely reacted, batting it aside with a casual swipe of his hand. I pressed myself against the fence, my pulse roaring in my ears. He was close now, so close I could see the cracks in the porcelain mask, the way the moonlight reflected off its smooth surface. His hand reached into his pocket, and I flinched, expecting to see a knife, a weapon. But instead, he pulled out a small piece of paper. He held it out to me, tilting his head slightly, as if daring me to take it. With trembling fingers, I reached for the paper. He didn't move, his gaze never leaving mine as I unfolded it slowly. My eyes widened as I read the words scrawled in neat, precise handwriting. "I've been watching you." My blood turned to ice. I looked up, my breath hitching. He was standing right in front of me now, so close I could see my own terrified reflection in the blank eyes of his mask. Then he moved, fast, faster than I could react. His hand shot out, grabbing my wrist in a grip like iron. I tried to scream, to struggle, but he shoved me back hard, my head slamming against the fence. Stars exploded in my vision, and I felt the world spin around me. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was that grotesque, smiling mask. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold, damp pavement. My head throbbed, and for a moment I couldn't remember where I was or what had happened. Then it all came rushing back. The chase, the alley, the masked man. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around wildly. The alley was empty. There was no sign of him anywhere. But as I turned to run, my foot kicked something small and crumpled. The piece of paper. I picked it up, my hands shaking, and unfolded it again. But this time, there was a new message written beneath the first one. "See you again soon." My heart nearly stopped. I spun around, searching the shadows, but the alley was empty. The street beyond was empty. The entire town felt deserted, but I knew he was out there, watching, waiting, and he'd be back. The snow started falling steadily as I drove deeper into the forest, the winding road slick and treacherous under my tires. It wasn't even supposed to snow this early, but that was October for you. Unpredictable, raw, and sometimes cruel. I had been putting off this trip for years, but something inside me had finally given in. Maybe it was a sense of obligation, or maybe it was just the need for some isolation. Whatever the reason, I found myself heading to my parents' old cabin, hidden away in the woods where the trees loomed tall and dark. They'd passed a few years ago, leaving the place abandoned. I hadn't been back since the funeral. Life just seemed to get in the way, and besides, there were too many memories here, both good and bad. Now, though, I figured it was time to sort through their things, clear out what was left, and finally decide what to do with the property. The drive took longer than expected, the snow turning the road into a narrow white ribbon. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, the headlights illuminated its weathered exterior. It looked the same as it had in my childhood: dark wood, a slanted roof, and a porch that creaked even in the wind. Snow blanketed the ground, and everything was deathly silent except for the gentle patter of flakes hitting the earth. I killed the engine and got out, my breath fogging in the chilly air. The key slid into the old lock with a familiar click, and I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The cabin was freezing inside, the kind of deep, bone-chilling cold that settles into an empty place. I flicked on the light switch, and a single bulb buzzed to life, casting a weak glow over the living room. Dust coated the furniture, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and decay. I stood for a moment, listening to the silence, then shook off the unease that crept over me. I didn't have time for nerves. I set down my bag and got to work, moving from room to room, checking for any damage and making a mental list of what needed to be done. Most of the stuff was as my parents had left it: blankets folded neatly on the beds, old family photos lining the walls, the kitchen cupboard still stocked with outdated canned goods. After a few hours of cleaning and clearing out the downstairs, I decided to head up to the attic. It was the one place I had always avoided when I was a kid. There was something about it that made my skin crawl, even then. But now, it seemed like the logical place to start. Old clothes, holiday decorations, and probably a lot of junk I'd have to sort through. The attic stairs creaked loudly as I climbed, the narrow wooden steps groaning under my weight. I pushed open the trap door and climbed inside. The air up here was colder, the rafters lined with cobwebs that caught in the dim light of the single, naked bulb swinging overhead. Boxes were stacked haphazardly along the walls, and I shivered as I moved through the dusty space. As I started sifting through an old trunk filled with my dad's belongings, a prickling sensation ran down my spine, and I realized something felt off. I stopped and looked around, my gaze drifting to the small, dirty window on the far side of the attic. The glass was frosted over, but beyond it, through the swirling snow, I could just make out the silhouette of another cabin. The neighbor's cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't thought about that place in years. The Thompsons used to live there, a quiet older couple who would wave at me from their porch whenever I visited as a kid. They'd always been kind, baking cookies for me and my sister, telling us stories of the woods. But they'd both died a few years back in a car accident. After that, their cabin had been left to rot, just like ours. And yet, as I peered through the fogged-up window, I could see a faint, flickering light inside the Thompsons' cabin. I squinted, leaning closer to the glass. The light wasn't strong, just a dull orange glow, but it was unmistakable. My pulse quickened. There shouldn't be anyone there. No one had lived in that cabin for years. Maybe it was just a reflection or some kind of trick of the light, I told myself. But then I saw movement. Two figures stood at the window, facing me. Even from this distance, I could make out the shapes of their heads, the curve of their shoulders. They were standing still, perfectly still, watching me. My breath hitched, and I took a step back, my heart thudding in my chest. It was impossible. I knew it was. The Thompsons were dead. I blinked, my hands trembling, but the figures didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me through the falling snow. A cold dread seeped into my bones as I realized that they were standing exactly where I remembered their living room window being. They hadn't moved a muscle since I'd spotted them. It was as if they were frozen in place. Slowly, I turned away from the window, trying to shake the icy fear that gripped me. I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus on the task at hand. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. I was tired. I was alone. The snow and the dark can make you see things that aren't there. But the fear didn't go away. It stayed with me, a heavy, suffocating weight. I tried to distract myself by going through the boxes, pulling out old photo albums, musty clothes, and stacks of brittle newspapers. But every few minutes, I found myself glancing back at the window, expecting to see them again. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I moved back to the window and looked out. The figures were gone. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by confusion. The light in the cabin was still there, flickering faintly through the snow, but the shapes were gone. I leaned closer, pressing my face to the cold glass, trying to see into the dark cabin across the way. Then the light went out. My heart dropped. The darkness beyond the window was complete, the snow swirling outside, making it impossible to see anything. I stepped back, my breath fogging up the glass. I was being ridiculous, I knew that. There was no one in that cabin. It was just an empty, abandoned house. I turned to leave the attic, but as I did, a soft creak sounded from the far corner of the room. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. Slowly, I turned the beam toward the sound. There, at the far end of the attic, was a small door, one I didn't remember being there before. It was half open, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. My skin prickled, and I took a step back. And then I heard it, a faint sound drifting from the open door, a whisper, my name. I spun around, my pulse racing, and bolted for the attic stairs. I stumbled down, nearly falling in my haste, and slammed the trapdoor shut behind me. I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The cabin was silent, empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced out the living room window, half expecting to see the Thompsons staring back at me from their darkened cabin. But there was nothing there, just the snow and the empty woods. I turned away and froze. The Thompsons were standing on my porch. They were right outside the window, their faces pale and twisted in the dim light. They were smiling, their eyes wide and unblinking. Slowly, they raised their hands and pressed them against the glass, their fingers leaving smudges on the pane. I stumbled back, my legs trembling. The door was locked. It had to be locked, but the knob turned slowly, and then the door swung open. It was late October, and a heavy snowstorm had rolled in earlier that evening, blanketing everything in a thick, unbroken sheet of white. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and making the old wooden house groan. I had been planning on a quiet night, curled up on the couch with a book, ignoring the rest of the world as I watched the snow pile up. The place felt colder than usual, despite the heating being turned all the way up. The weather had been strange lately, the first snow coming early and hitting hard. The house, an old family home I'd inherited, was already isolated at the best of times, perched on a small hill at the edge of town. With the snowstorm raging, it felt completely cut off. I remember looking at the clock. It was just past midnight, when the power went out. The sudden darkness caught me off guard, the soft glow of my reading lamp vanishing, leaving only the dim light of the fireplace casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. I cursed under my breath and stood up, feeling my way through the room. My phone was upstairs on the charger, but I knew the battery was low. I reached the kitchen and fumbled in the drawer for a flashlight, finally finding it and flicking it on. A weak, flickering beam illuminated the small, narrow space. The house was utterly silent, except for the wind howling outside, battering against the walls and roof. I glanced out the window, but all I could see was the swirling white of the blizzard. Everything was buried under snow, and the thought of going out to check the power box was laughable. I sighed, deciding I'd have to make do until the storm passed. And then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. A knock, just once, a heavy, deliberate sound against the front door. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I hadn't seen or heard another soul all night. No one would be out in this weather, not in the middle of a snowstorm. I strained to listen, my heart beat loud in my ears. Maybe it was a branch, blown loose by the wind. I tried to convince myself of that, but something about the sound didn't fit. It was too purposeful. Another knock, louder this time. Whoever it was, they were out there, standing in the freezing dark. I took a step back, glancing over my shoulder toward the front hallway. I should have just ignored it. No one would be out here, and not unless they were in serious trouble. But something compelled me forward, something I couldn't quite name. The flashlight's beam wavered as I approached the door, the rest of the house swallowed in shadows. I hesitated at the threshold, my breath misting in the cold air. The knock came again, insistent, reverberating through the silent house. My hand trembled as I reached for the door handle. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding small and weak. No response. I leaned closer, pressing my ear to the wood, trying to listen. The wind howled, the snow battered against the walls, but beneath it, I could hear something else. A soft, muffled sound, like the crunch of boots on fresh snow. "Hello?" I tried again, louder this time. Still no answer. I should have walked away right then, gone back to the safety of the living room, but instead, I took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door creaked open, the icy wind whipping past me, and I squinted into the darkness. The snow fell thick and fast, swirling around in a chaotic dance, but I could make out the shape of someone standing just beyond the porch steps. "Do you need help?" I shouted over the storm. The figure didn't move. It was hard to see clearly through the blizzard, but they were tall, dressed in dark, heavy clothing, their outline blurred by the falling snow. They just stood there, motionless, facing the house. Something about the way they were standing made my skin crawl. They weren't shivering, weren't hunched against the cold. They were just still, like they were waiting. "Who are you?" I called, but the wind snatched my words away. For a long moment, the figure didn't respond. Then, slowly, they took a step forward, the crunch of snow audible even over the roar of the storm. I took an instinctive step back, gripping the doorframe tightly. "Do you need help?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. No answer. The figure took another step, and I caught a glimpse of their face, or what should have been a face. But there was only darkness, as if the hood of their coat was an empty void. A chill that had nothing to do with the storm crept down my spine. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and slammed the door shut. The wood rattled in its frame, and I threw the deadbolt, my hands shaking. What the hell was that? I stood there, breathing hard, listening. The wind screamed outside, but I couldn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no knocking, just the storm raging in the night. I took a step back, then another, my eyes fixed on the door. What had I seen out there? Was it just a trick of the light, the snow distorting shapes, or had there really been someone standing out there, staring at me? Then, without warning, the knocking started again. But this time it wasn't on the front door. It was coming from the back of the house. The sound echoed through the darkened rooms, a heavy, deliberate pounding. I spun around, the flashlight beam dancing crazily over the walls as I tried to pinpoint the source. The knocking was louder now, more insistent, reverberating through the empty halls. I backed away, my heart racing. There was no one outside. There couldn't be anyone outside. The snow was too deep, the storm too fierce. I was alone here. I had to be. But the knocking continued, shifting now, moving along the walls of the house. First at the back door, then at the side windows, then closer, as if someone was circling the cabin, pounding on every surface they passed. I stumbled into the living room, my head spinning, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my chest. The flashlight flickered, and I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow passing by the front windows. I whipped around, but it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Then the knocking stopped. I stood there, trembling, listening to the wind howl outside. The house was silent again, the only sound the faint creaking of the old beams settling in the cold. And then slowly, the doorknob turned. I watched, paralyzed, as the front door rattled in its frame, the deadbolt straining against the pressure. Someone was outside. Someone was trying to get in. I backed away, my mouth dry, my hands slick with sweat. The knob twisted again, harder this time, the wood groaning under the force. Then, with a sudden, violent snap, the door swung open, slamming against the wall. The wind roared into the house, carrying with it a flurry of snow. And there, standing in the doorway, was the figure. But it was closer now, clearer. The dark hood, the heavy coat. No face, just an empty, hollow void where eyes and a mouth should be. I could feel its gaze on me, even without eyes to see. I turned and ran, the flashlight beam bobbing wildly as I sprinted through the house. The shadows seemed to close in around me, the air thick and suffocating. I reached the kitchen, threw open the door to the basement, and stumbled down the steps, slamming the door shut behind me. I stood there in the pitch darkness, my chest heaving, listening. The wind howled outside, the house creaked and groaned, but above all that, I could hear it. The soft, steady sound of footsteps, moving through the house above me. They moved slowly, deliberately, pausing at every door, every corner. Closer, always closer. I held my breath, the darkness pressing in around me, praying it wouldn't find me. But then the footsteps stopped, right outside the basement door, and the knob began to turn.